And we're live. Hey, man, how are you?
Hey, good, thank you. Yes. Yeah, looking forward to this topic, ROI today.
All
Very,
right.
very excited. As I was saying to you before the podcast starts, I think this stuff's really sexy. So we want to get that stuff across. I think if people think of this as dry and boring, they won't engage with it. There's just so much money unlocked in these to be unlocked by these concepts. So yeah.
ROI super strategies is our topic for today. Hey, everybody, if you're jumping on with us live, hello. Give us a like or love or comment. Let us know where you're watching from. I'm personally sitting here, if you're watching this with us live, in a back bedroom in my mom's home in California. I'm visiting, and so it's not my usual location. But anyway, I think we're making this work, and so we should have a great session today, recording our podcast for the e-commerce leader. So, Michael, are you excited about this one?
Absolutely, yeah. So I realized I jumped straight into the asking you how I was. I didn't ask you how you are. How's California? Is it sunnier than Washington where you are?
It's so nice, man. We just woke up and went for a big walk yesterday. Beautiful blue skies, and it's just fun to be down here and spend time with family and that kind of thing. So yeah, we're loving the blue skies of California. You can't beat it. So
yeah, I bet. Yeah, I can imagine. Although London's actually having some blue skies, amazingly it does happen, and everyone's just flocking outdoors in lockdown. So yeah, I'm very excited about this. This whole microeconomics thing. I am a major nerd. I'm just to give you a flavor, guys, of who you're dealing with here. I've got a periodic table of the elements behind our bedroom wall door because I love it so much. So I really am quite a major nerd. But on the other hand, I think what's really beautiful about really great sort of formulas, whether in physics, E equals mc squared or whatever it may be, and in this case in finance, is one simple bit of maths or relatively simple concept can be applied consistently across your business, and even one of those applied consistently can really hugely grow things you care about. Probably, hopefully, profit, not revenue. Even one. So I think that if you have even 5 or 6 concepts that you take away from this series, or 1 or 2, and you apply them, there could be huge power in it. So that's why I'm very excited about this stuff.
Awesome. Debbie said she's watching from Jerusalem, Israel. Wow, Debbie, beautiful. Thank you so much for tuning in from Israel. That's amazing. George said he's watching from Tampa, Florida. So welcome, George. And so feel free to leave us a comment or a like or love if you're watching on Facebook. We're going to kick off our actual podcast in just a moment, and we'd love to have you ask questions along the way. And but yeah, it's just an honor to be able to do this. So that's fun stuff, man. Fun stuff. It's an honor to be able to connect with people around the world. So, Michael, you ready to do the podcast? We ready to kick this thing off?
Yeah. Simple question. Okay. You're kicking off the initial sort of introduction, right?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Let's do this. Here we go. Return on investment concepts applied to e-commerce is one of our e-commerce first principles. And in the last couple episodes, we discussed what is first principles thinking. And then we've also done an episode on asymmetrical risk and reward. But today's session is all about return on investment super strategies. Michael, I know this concept is exciting to you. So how do you see this ROI idea applying to your business in particular? And why don't you just set the stage here for us for this session?
So I think a return on investment is, on the one hand, a pretty simple concept that people apply a lot when they're sort of discussing sort of getting into e-commerce in early stages. And on the other hand, it's a way of thinking. And I guess that what we're talking about today with the super strategies and the way you framed it, as you usually have that knack of putting things in a nice, simple, big, memorable framework. It's really applying that way of thinking across the board. I think it's a really great sort of mindset. It's also some formulas, and it's also something you should be applying to measuring in the economics of your own business. So it applies in lots of different ways. I think one of the ways that it also implies is flipping around a cost-focused mindset, which ironically for more established entrepreneurs in this space, because there are so many costs in e-commerce, moving atoms is harder than moving electrons, as they say, that you can get very, very focused on reducing costs. And whilst that is an incredibly important thing, the flip side of looking at the same situation can often be, what's my return on investment? And that's, I think, the difference is that it could be more of a growth mindset that's implied by that. So yeah, there's an awful lot implied by this term, and I think there's just so much to dig into here.
Yeah, I love this topic as well. The thing that I think sparked my interest in this whole idea originally was when I was a full-time employee. I'd gotten a hold of the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book, Robert Kiyosaki. his basic concept is that you've got to take earnings from anything, your job or whatever it is, and then start to invest it in creating assets that will pay you back. And the ROI logic of that, I think, is just the kernel of the idea is super important, is that you're never going to get real traction unless you figure out the methodology of making an investment, managing it, and then extracting value from it. And that basic concept in business is so fundamental, we almost neglect to talk about it, but it's just the kernel of the idea that changes our mindset from being just an employee somewhere where we don't have to think about these things to being the business owner where we say, hey, I'm going to risk it with a little bit of money, a little bit of time, a little bit of, my efforts and energy on this concept, and I'm hoping to get an outcome from it. And that basic ROI thinking, I think, is so critical for people to really, really evaluate and think through. That's why I'm excited about this topic today as well. So, excellent.
Yeah, I think he had a pretty good way, Robert Kiyosaki, of kind of simplifying some important concepts down and sort of making them very popular. I guess like Tim Ferriss had a similar sort of function.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, and interesting. Just before we dive into this, just in terms of one's relationship to it, if you are an e-commerce leader as opposed to an e-commerce manager, it's very easy to think, I'm going to grow my business by just doing more stuff, more management, more of the same we've just done. Whereas this way of thinking is more about standing back and looking at your business as a whole and thinking about how you can engineer it into the business practices.
Yeah.
So, okay, we got 3 super strategies we're going to discuss. So do you want to share the first one of those with us?
Sure. Yeah. The first one is to understand that this is your game to play and you get to define the rules. Now, this is a super strategy because it's really a whole set of strategies and ideas. And let me just unpack this idea for a minute. But I really want people to ponder this deep idea. This is, you get to decide. There's an old, I think it's a Chinese proverb. They say that before you start any game, decide on the rules and, when you're going to stop type thing. And so here are a few kernels of the idea here about you defining the game that you're going to play. How much you're going to invest? What are you going to invest it into? How much return on investment or money you get back in addition to your original amount invested do you expect? How long are you willing to wait for that payday? Will you use debt to fuel the growth? And when are you going to stop playing the game? And all of these things are basic concepts that I think are really vital as we get to define and decide, what the rules of the game are. And I'll never forget Jeff Bezos's initial shareholder letter, like in 1997. And he basically said to everybody, don't expect profit from this business anytime soon. They're going to be investing for growth. And he just laid it out. He said, look, we're not going to be, generating net profit. We're going to be continuously scaling to dominate this space. So he was, from the first letter he wrote to investors, defining the rules of the game that he wanted to play. And he had, obviously people get along on board with him for that concept. So there you have it. That's the first super strategy as I like to think about these things. What are your thoughts and reflections on those ideas?
Wow, so much to say, but let me just keep it fairly simple. To each point then, maybe I can make a little point. The first was how much you invest. The obvious question is, okay, how much do you have? But if you prove to be good at what you're doing, you can probably get other people to invest with you as well. And that's one thing that people neglect. But in terms of just keeping it simple, how much you have to invest, one question is simply asset allocation. So I would say that running an e-commerce business or any kind of business is a high risk, high reward type activity. If you haven't paid your own mortgage off yet and you have no pension, then maybe you shouldn't even be doing it. If you have some kind of wealth and some kind of sort of basic plan for retiring with not much money, but at least you get to eat, even if it's ramen noodles, then that might be the case to choose to allocate some of that to a high risk. And your age and your risk profile really are 2 factors to take into account there. So that's the first thing that strikes me. It's kind of an asset allocation question within your life. You say how much you put into your Amazon business versus, say, having property, which a lot of people I work with have, and we have as well, a little bit of rental property, versus a pension plan, cash for the next few years, that sort of thing. The ROI you expect is an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I guess that will come down to which vehicles you pick, which is kind of the flip side of what I was just saying, which is if you want an aggressively high ROI, you're going to have to go for a model like creating a vehicle, like creating your own business, as opposed to buying existing property. So there's a couple of immediate thoughts. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think these are just a set of questions. You're right. They definitely do impact the business to play with. Parts of e-commerce, for example, retail arbitrage. You can get involved in retail arbitrage with $20 in your pocket. Go to a garage sale, look for amazing new in the package items, put them on Amazon, and you're off to the races. And that's one of the value propositions of kind of those entry level models: retail arbitrage, garage sailing, online arbitrage. You can start with very, very humble amounts, and therefore, obviously, if you start with that humble amount, that's all you're risking, that plus your time. And so that's the appeal, really, I think, of some of the entry level business models. And there's nothing wrong with them. I mean, there are people who scale those to 6 and 7 figures, and so they can do it because they can incrementally invest. I think another piece of the rules that you want to define for yourself are, one of the things that you want to ask yourself about is, how frequently do you want to make bets on inventory purchases? Now, and this is really important. If you make one big bet a year by buying a big container full of stuff from China in the late fall, so you can send it into Amazon for Q4, you're making a massive bet. But if you go retail arbitraging every day of the week and just send in those small purchases, you're making hundreds of small bets. And I think that's really important to think through. Like, how frequently do you want to bet, and what are you betting on? And it is a bet. I mean, it is a gamble. At the heart of it, and the more you can say to yourself, I know exactly what's going to happen, the less risk there is. I mean, if you know how the mousetrap springs shut, then it's not that big a risk. And so you want to think through, like, what are you willing to risk or not? I think that's a key part of it.
So, I mean, I know that you've got that coming up, the risk reward thing, but you've already mentioned it because we talked about that last time. I mean, I think, yes, you cannot avoid the risk reward question coming up. And I think where people go wrong is they're either overly aware of risk and don't enter the water at all, or they're over aware of reward, ignore it, and then just think about ROI, as opposed to balancing the two out. Exactly as you just articulated. I mean, you could make a load of money quickly, ROI, over a short time, which is, by the way, something I've got to come back to with private label, or you could lose a lot of money quite quickly as well. And then with retail arb, it's less dramatic. So yeah, those are basically risk reward as opposed to ROI kind of payoffs. One thing that you just brought up though is really, I think that the word ROI, whilst as a basic concept, is fine. If we're going to talk strictly about the profit divided by the amount that you invested, that's what the usual ROI calculation. It's simple, easy to understand, easy to communicate, but it disregards time, which is kind of ludicrous, because if I put $100,000 into inventory now and it returns 100% ROI, but it takes 20 years, that's not very attractive compared to 20 days. So the solution is to use an annualized ROI figure, formula. I'm not going to read out the formula on the podcast because it would kind of sound a bit unmanageable. But for example, if you buy some stock in, say, January for $1,250 and sell it in August for $1,520, you've got a 21% ROI, but annualized, that's a 35% ROI, which is a lot more attractive than if it was the same ROI but over 2 years. So I think we have to get that time component in, which is, for example, if you're comparing private label returns with an retail arbitrage business, you would need to annualize things, so you're comparing apples with apples. So it's just a simple but very important point, because most people just throw around ROI numbers with no time frame attached, which for me means it's meaningless. You have to have a time frame.
I totally agree. And you hear a lot of people say stuff like, "Oh, what's your profit on that product or that that effort?" And you'll hear people just throw out a number, 70%. And a lot of times, and I've been doing this for, I have an MBA. And I've been doing e-commerce for a dozen years. I still always ask people, what are your basic numbers that you're using there? Just ask them what their initial numbers are that go into that. If you're in a situation where that matters. Now, if you're just, having, drinks or something and you're chit-chatting with people and they use phrases like that, you can't really be an inquisitor and kind of grill them on it. But as a coach, when people say, "Oh, my profit's 82%," I always say, "What is the per unit, numbers, and then how did you come to that?" And time is certainly a consideration, and
it is.
I think that's important to realize that these numbers can be thrown around arbitrarily. We don't always have the same perspective.
Absolutely. Small thing, Jason. I tried to put it on the chat, but you're showing me, but it's you talking. So we might want to. I don't have control over that. Sorry, guys. This is like the middle of the podcast realities here. There we go. So it's up to you to control that because I can't control it at my end. And you're muted. It's all going well. There you go. My.
Okay, sorry. Technical.
That's all right. That's no problem. Yeah, a little technical challenge there. Yeah. So anyway, so we there was anyway, it's a podcast. I knew he was going to hear that bit. Yeah. Good. So
love it.
Where were we? Yeah. So now just other thing that I really wanted to pick up on, that you're very, very good sort of rules, you're defining the game for yourself. The implication is you get to define your rules, which is a very American way of looking at life and very kind of can-do attitude. I would suggest that's great, but it needs to be within the context of probabilities of success. The longer you wait with a business, the more likely statistically it is to die. And I'm just sorry to say that, but we all know the statistics, however true they are. 80% of businesses die within 5 years. Of the remaining ones, 80% die within the next 15. Yeah, is that true? Those exact? I don't know. Is that a general tendency? I think we can all say probably about right. So there has got to be an accounting for the fact that the longer you wait, on the one hand, if your business keeps growing, which is quite a big if, then the bigger payday. But on the other hand, there is the factor that the longer you try and keep a business alive, let alone thriving, that the less probability there is that that's going to happen. It's not saying it can't be done. I've got several multi-generation clients that I've worked with over the years, so it could definitely be done. But it's the exception rather than the rule. So one of the things to think about is how easy is it to keep a business alive for 3 to 5 years and then sell it versus for 20, 30 years. And that's a thing that everyone has to weigh out for themselves. But I'm just flagging up as a factor that is somewhat an external factor, not just a decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with just the basic sentiment of it. However, the optimist in me is more focused on, the question is, why would those businesses fail? And if you get better and better at ROI logic at the unit level or the product level, then the question over the long term is not whether you can make a profit, it's whether you can make a business. And I think businesses fail because people are bad at making businesses, bad at hiring, bad at facilities management, debt management, legal obligations, filing taxes, partnership failures, on and on and on. I mean, there are a million reasons why a business can blow apart, but the kernel of a business is, can you make a profit at a per unit level? And the better you get at that, the more risk you take out. Like if you solve that problem, then all you've got to solve is all those other problems.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important way to look at it. And literally, as Robert Kiyosaki says, and I don't know why, I'm not a huge Robert Kiyosaki fan, but his quotes come to mind today. As he says, if a business fails after 5 years, who cares? Start another one and just keep starting them and learn as you go until you get to the point where you say, oh, I learned all the ways to fail. Now I know exactly how to run a business for the long term, and it's really profitable. Yeah. And that's the mindset. And I guess that's the American optimism.
Yeah, it's great. We naturally fall into that, which I think is a really useful dynamic in any business. If you have a team of people that are all raving optimists, then you haven't kind of waterproofed your business plan. If they're all kind of pessimists or a bit too sort of easily see the problems, they never get started. So yeah, I think it's hopefully a useful dynamic for people. The only other thing I would say is, if a business fails and you're 60 years old, because talking about Kiyosaki, like you, I'm not necessarily always a fan of his, but he could put some context very, very well. An age-related, life stage question. It's not so much age really, because you could retire at the age of 90, like my old landlord invested in the stock markets for 60 straight years and retired at 90. Other people are, retire at 60. But if you're close to retirement, you probably want a lower risk profile than if you're less, and define retirement and define whether you should or not. These are, again, personal questions. But I do think that Robert Kiyosaki did say something like, if you're going to fail in business, you want to try and do it before the age of 30. So for me, at the age of 47, I'm kind of got less time to build a new business than I would have had at 27. So
less interested in failure.
Yeah, which doesn't mean that you have to be a pessimist, but it's just you got to think this stuff through for yourself. And I think one thing that strikes me from this very conversation is, if you're a born optimist, you make a plan that works for somebody who will, when the stuff hits the fan, go, don't worry, we'll figure it out. If you're more risk averse or worrier, as I probably am naturally, hey, I'm the son of a lawyer and a teacher, I'm likely to have been trained from an early age to be, worry about things, then maybe the right business model for me would be more risk averse, and that's right for me. So I think it is, in the end, as you said, a very personal decision. So it's very interesting stuff, actually. So what's the second super strategy then? There's plenty to talk about there. What's next?
Sure. Yeah. Second one is decide what you're going to invest with. What are you willing to risk? And it's actually more subtle than it might look. And it would include not just your money and whether that's a one-time or an ongoing commitment of your money, which is a big difference. But it also is your own time and whether that's a one-time or ongoing commitment, and your employees' time or your business assets, and whether that's one-time or ongoing. And these things that you decide to invest with are just really important to think through. And a lot of times, if we're money poor but time rich, we can invest with time. Other times, we're time poor and we're money rich and we can invest. But either way, we've got to really be thoughtful about what's going to go into this venture. The worst thing you can possibly do as an entrepreneur, and many people do it, is set themselves up for a low wage 24/7 365 job, and they're their own boss and they're a jerk to themselves. That is not a good investment. What I mean? Like if that's what you're aiming for, that's what you're going to invest with and into, is that perpetual slavery to yourself for your own business. That's not a good investment. And you want to think through these things. What are you putting on the line, really? What are your thoughts on that?
I totally hear what you were just describing as being a nasty boss to yourself in a badly paid job. That I'd have a bad tendency to fall into that. And again, maybe it comes from a poverty mentality that was somehow inherited from my parents. Both grew up in the 1950s in the UK, which was when the UK was busy paying back America massive war debts, which didn't get paid off until 1997. But I won't hold it against you. Joking apart, there was a lot of poverty in a lot of countries in Europe and indeed a lot of the world at that point. And maybe there was a sort of overly cautious mentality that is not correct for the current situation. So that you have a very good point about not setting up a situation where you end up investing too little money, but investing too much of your time. And actually, when you look at what that would do relative to a job, it's just worse than a job. And it's so easy to do that, actually. I think it's very easy, particularly with things like retail arbitrage. Again, not down on the model. As you said, you could scale that to 6-7 figures, but with the right mentality. And I think otherwise, you end up with the classic Amazon seller, and I guess true for e-commerce generally, you end up with an unstable job working for a really slave-driving, disorganized boss, which is not good. And you're absolutely right to flag that up as a possibility. And the only solution to that is to mindfully engineer a really different situation and really keep checking. And that's where a coach or a community can really, really help you make sure you're not doing that, because you can't see the wood for the trees. When you're in a business, it's almost impossible to see your own business, however smart you are,
Totally agree. And I think the nuance here is like, so for example, what type of investment can you make for what type of return? Here's an example. Let's say you've set up a business and it's a going concern, total sales in the high 6 or 7 figures or beyond, but you're working yourself to death and you're constantly at it. Well, obviously one of the investments you can make is an investment in an employee that liberates your time. And if that employee makes you zero money, but they give you back 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week of your personal time and they cover their own expenses, is that a good investment?
The old 4-hour work week question. Yes, I remember that one.
Yes, exactly right.
It's a very good question. Right. It does depend on your personal circumstances, how your marriage is doing, and a lot of a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, trash their own relationships, and that's really a huge cost. There's a quote by the CEO of Pepsi or somebody like that. I can't remember. I have to dig it out, but he said something like, there are 5 balls in life: work, blah, 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 whatever the other ones were, and relationships. He said the other ones are rubber balls, but you drop the relationships and health. Oh, no, that's right. With work, health, something else, and then work, family. He said, work's a rubber ball. If you drop it, it'll bounce back, which is interesting from a CEO from a hyper-competitive business. But he said, but relationships and health, you drop those, they're glass balls. They don't just come back intact. And I thought that was an interesting reality check.
I didn't hear what your phrase where you were saying. Rubber ball. That's what you were saying. Yeah, the
Rubber
rubber
ball, yeah.
ball versus a
Yeah,
glass ball. Oh, I
exactly
love
right.
that. That's a really good metaphor.
Mm.
Yeah,
It
I
is, and
love
I
that.
think I occasionally say to people that I'm coaching, do you need to spend less time in your business because your marriage is obviously suffering? And like, I
Hmm.
am not a marriage guidance counselor. I have no interest in becoming that. But I know from my own marriage that, it's really, really important to handle that.
Yeah.
And one of the conscious objectives you can set for your goal, but for a slightly less than business-like reason, but for your life is I want to work, 10 hours a week less, but
Hmm.
actually make as much money or even more. But even as you said, even if it's a little bit less money, but
Yeah.
your business survives and your marriage survives, that's a big win. So yeah, I
Yeah.
totally hear you on that. I've got some thoughts on the employee time thing. I mean, I think in terms of measuring return
Sure.
on investment for employees, there's some crude metrics and some rather better metrics. So crude metric is revenue per employee. Anything that was the word revenue
Hmm.
is basically, I'm going to put this politely, a vanity metric. That's the polite version. It's the way of,
Hmm.
impressing your friends at a bar if you're at an entrepreneurs convention. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's a very rational thing to drive things. A better metric is gross profit, of course. But profit per employee is a little bit crude as well. The better thing that Greg Crabtree from Simple Numbers Straight Talk Big Profits, one of my favorite thinkers about this stuff, a very robust CPA with very entrepreneur friendly ways of thinking. He says, think about gross profit, not revenue, per labor dollar, not per employee. And then suddenly it becomes really an ROI equation. You put money into labor, you get a profit out.
Hmm. Wow.
And that's called labor. And the more specific thing you want is labor efficiency is gross profit per non-labor gross profit dollar. So you that's a way of measuring the ROI on labor, basically, which is a super
Yeah.
way of doing it. I don't think it's super hard to calculate when you make a mission of setting your finances up that way
Hmm.
to measure it. But it's something I don't know anyone who does it. So I think it's really underused as a way of doing it.
I love it.
Important stuff, I think. There's
Yeah.
a couple of other things he says about that, by the way, which I'd love to discuss with you. He says he's got 4 little things about labor in relationship to ROI. All labor must be productive. And another interesting thing, which probably begs another podcast, but let's just knock it around. Culture, productivity, and profitability must all live in harmony. Culture becomes extinct without profitability. Profitability becomes extinct without productivity. I thought this is powerful
Hmm.
stuff. I really like Greg
Hmm.
Crabtree. What are your thoughts on those?
I like that concept a lot. I'm actually spending time and energy right now looking at Muhammad Yunus's work on social businesses. So profitability, the profitability piece is not just ownership, net profit back to them. I mean, in the social business context, profitability could be distributed to all the employees. It could be, again, as we already talked about, time, value. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at this depending on the context. But I do think those are interesting ideas, how they work together for sure. Yeah.
Another thing he said a couple of other things. Again, this is kind of ROI as it impacts on people. He says, Greg Crabtree again, set wages based on the market, not on the cost of living. So it should only change on the basis of market forces. And the other one is evaluate talent based on productivity, not on years of experience, which is an interesting one, right? I mean, it's kind of easy to say and hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Anyway, a couple of thoughts about employees. So that's the first 2 strategies. What's our third super strategy for ROI?
Super strategy number 3 is a huge one, and that is determine your approach to other people's money. Now, other people's money could mean debt. It also could mean investor income or partner income. I mean, investment. So it's beyond just taking loans. I think it means taking partners, taking equity, investment from investors, that kind of thing. So other people's money. So here's a few nuance points around this. Other people's money reduces your need for upfront cash, obviously. Like it gives you more money than you currently have. That's cool. But it creates an obligation. It potentially compounds your return on your own money if things go well, but it also can compound your losses if they go badly. And number 3, it can also speed your growth radically. Like, with the other people's money, you can literally do in like one investing cycle or 1 year, let's call it, what you might have done yourself in 2, 3, 4, 5 years if you were just bootstrapping it. So it really gives you fuel, for the rocket. And then finally, the 4th thing about other people's money is Money does not come without strings attached. It adds other people's voices, other people's priorities, other people's rights to the business operation you're running. And I mean, those are really important things to think through. Is it worth doing or not? What's your approach to it? And how are you going to weave it into the return on investment thinking? What are your thoughts on it, Michael?
You're right. This is really worth thinking. Yeah, there's a lot of, again, the first thing that strikes me is the same thing. The fundamental concept behind asymmetric risk reward we talked about is risk reward analysis. And if you're going to considerably increase the risk, you want to make sure that you're going to considerably increase the reward. And specifically, again, we were talking about optimists versus realist/pessimists, and we tend to fall at different ends of that spectrum, which is always fun. And we're falling into the cliche of the optimistic American. I know lots of optimistic Brits. Maybe I'm just a cynical person, but again, you need to make sure that you're creating a business for yourself and your family. If your wife or yourself or both of you are going to be awake at night worrying about the amount of debt you have, even if theoretically somebody else would be perfectly comfortable with it as a business decision, then you shouldn't do it, because I think you've got to make a business that works for yourself, right? And that's when economics-driven thinking needs to be nuanced with personal kind of emotional response to economics, really, is the first thing that strikes me.
Yeah, totally agree. And this thinking is really important because how you set up a deal, with other people is incredibly important. If you take money, for example, and it's a loan and you pay it back, simple interest, great. That's very, very different than taking a commitment to have future royalty stream or ongoing, like, hey, you have to pay somebody in perpetuity forever, from any incremental sales. So just these small changes in how you apply other people's money can make a huge, huge difference in terms of your net profit. It really can be just a completely different from success to failure or failure to success, depending on how you use other people's money or don't, and I think that's really critical to think through.
I just want to say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, tying things back into the asymmetric risk reward ratio we're talking about, I'm always obsessed with trying to put that into every part of my business, particularly other people's money. So I think the main thing is to limit the downside. And the reason for that isn't just being a pessimist, although if you are more pessimistic/cautious, you should really focus on that. But even if you want to gain a lot, if you think there's a massive upside potential, as Jeff Bezos said, if there's a 1 in 10 chance of making 100 times return on something, then you should take that bet, but you're going to have 9 times where it fails. And you want to make sure you can physically cash flow and mentally survive those 9 times. So, a couple of things that occurred to me. First of all, apply other people's money only to highly proven product lines or sales channels. So people every so often say, should I borrow money to start an unproven business? I always just say, absolutely not. And if you want to do it, I can't help you.
Right.
So a couple of things that are nuances to that. Just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it couldn't. For example, just because you've never had an Amazon account suspended doesn't mean it couldn't happen. So you may want to consider building up a Shopify channel to say 10% of your revenue, even for no other reason than it's a risk mitigation factor. And then I might take on more risk, other people's money in the Amazon channel, but knowing that I've got a channel that can keep the lights on should that fail for a while. The other one is risk factors related to product types, which again, you may never have historically had somebody cut themselves on your hunting knives that you're foolishly selling, but it could happen, right? And you need to just think about the fact that you may not want to pile a bunch of money into something, which if you scale it enough, you could end up being the next Wayfair sort of test case, which you don't want to have, right?
Yeah.
So that's the main thing that strikes me to de-risk OPM is just be careful what you apply it to, really.
Yeah, I think those are good principles. I guess my biggest suggestion for de-risking OPM would be to really, really evaluate what people call the cost of capital. And I think that's actually, all things being equal, if people took your suggestions in terms of just, how to not be foolish about using other people's money, but then you say, okay, well, it's going to be successful, then the biggest question you could ask yourself is, how much did it cost you? And you can get capital from all different sources. You can use your credit card. You can use a home equity line of credit. You can use a secured business loan from a bank. You can use an investor, writing you a check with the certain obligations that you guys create together. There's just so many different ways to get capital. The biggest question you can ask yourself is, what is the cost? And to your point, it's not just financial cost, but it's also the strings attached, their voice in the business, what your obligation is in terms of reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's a key part of understanding ROI is if you're going to use other people's money, how and how much to do, how big a risk to take. And people have sort of what you might call moral issues with debt. Biblical issues from a Christian point of view on that topic sometimes. And so you have to sort through that. Like, well, is that logical in my situation? Am I willing to take on debt or not? You hear voices of people who say never do that. And then you hear people who say, hey, it's just another part of financing your business. And, you've got to think it through yourself. And I think at the end of the day, that's the issue. You've got to decide for yourself what you're comfortable with,
It's interesting. I mean, there are Christians in the UK, clearly, but it's never something I've ever heard anyone talk about in my life outside of the USA. So I think that may be something that people in the US grapple with, because a lot of people are, church-going Christians. And I imagine that in the UK, for some Muslims, that could be an issue, because obviously they've got a sort of non-debt thing going on, rather like the Christians in the Middle Ages had. What they did is outsource it to the Jews, particularly in Italy. So I would argue that a lot of the time, people end up taking on debt-like things without admitting they're taking on debt. That's a whole different ball game. I'm going to leave that to the specialists to discuss. But you're right. You've got to make sure you can. So another implication is, I guess, in terms of business ethics, which we haven't talked about for a while, is for yourself, does your ethical framework match up with the business practices? Right. Of course. Absolutely right. And I guess you've got to have your own integrity about that. I mean, that's a personal thing. But you're right. You don't want to be doing something because you feel you should or have to, that you just feel bad about. Absolutely. The other thing I'd say is it's very easy to end up thinking that other people's money means debt or equity. And I think there are other things in between. I'm not saying these are just without their downsides, but you could consider factoring your receivables. That's got a lower risk profile. There are some more imaginative options. I spoke to a chap whose name I forget, which is really bad because I'm an affiliate of theirs, but I'll put it in the show notes. But you could do inventory purchase via those guys, which is really unique. So basically they buy your inventory in advance. It's for FBA sellers. Then you sell it on consignment. So they own it, but you sell it. And then you basically pay them back with a bit of interest. So that's quite different because they don't own a piece of your business. They have fewer claims over your business. So it's a simpler kind of model in some ways. So there are a few different ways of using other people's money that it's worth thinking about and being imaginative about if you're not comfortable with debt per se as well.
Love it. Well, let me wrap this up and then we'll ask you a final question. So the 3 ROI super strategies we've talked about today is, this is your game to play. Define your rules. Number 2 is decide what you're going to invest with. And number 3 is determine your approach to other people's money. So hopefully this has been a helpful episode today in the podcast. Michael, before we wrap up though, let me just ask you, we haven't ever talked about your consulting work recently and how you're, supporting folks there in London and beyond globally. Tell us a little bit about your consulting work, just as a blatant, opportunity, because we just haven't talked about your one-on-one work lately. So what's going on in your consulting practice?
Well, things are transitioning really. I'm transitioning out of services to startups because it's just hard to give people an ROI. Talking about ROI, it's just not very easy to charge even very modest money. So I've been working on some things with sort of smallish businesses in the sort of maybe $30,000-$40,000 a month range, trying to transition upwards. And I want to do that on a group course coaching level, which I'm designing right now, and got some cool insights from some business coaches on how to do that, how to run that. So that'll be coming over the next few months. I'm also privately working on some beta versions of deals with services for some mid-7-figure Amazon sellers I'm in discussions with. This is very early days, but I realized that doing conversion rate optimization on Amazon for me is kind of like falling off a log because I've done so much of it. But actually, a lot of businesses haven't got the time to do it. So I thought, well, actually, I was discussing with somebody else the other day on how to do it. And I thought, well, instead of telling them how to do it, I could just do it for them. And the trick with them that's going to be very interesting is how to do this in a systematizable way that you can do at scale, because the particular person I'm talking with has over 2,000 SKUs. So we need to figure out ways to pick our fights, as in which ones are going to be identify low-hanging fruit, which has good potential to improve the conversion rate, but the conversion rate's quite low. Typically, it would be high traffic, moderate conversion rate products. And then once we've got the 80-20 or even 95-5 of identifying those products, slickly then finding repeatable, scalable ways to optimize those at scale. So that's going to be a very, very interesting little project if that comes off. And then I'm looking to get a handful of clients to do that with as well. So that's quite exciting. I'm looking forward to doing that.
So how can people connect with you if they want to learn more about what you do?
Sure. The easiest thing, none of this stuff is out on any websites yet. So just michael@amazingfba.com. Just email me and just say that you're interested in having a chat, and we can just set up a Zoom call. And what I suggest, we have a very quick call just to see if it's something that could be something of interest. And if it is, then we have a longer call, possibly with anyone else from your team that needs to be on the call, and see if it's a match. I'm honestly not going to be highly salesy. What I'm looking to do is to kind of beta test an approach to make sure there's a great return for the clients, that I can scale it without going crazy. And then if it works, we'll just get a handful of clients on. So you won't get a hard pitch from me, but I'd love to explore how I can help, because I realize that I'm underusing my abilities, and I see a lot of problems. And rather than just advising people on how to do it, I've realized I should be getting involved in doing it with them.
Love it, man. All right. Well, wonderful episode. As always, thank you, sir. Had a great time today talking.
Me too. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's the podcast. Hey, thanks for hanging out with us today, everybody. Really appreciate it. Love the shout outs from around the world. And it's just an honor to be able to serve. My internet keeps cutting out, Michael, which is why I kept thinking we would just cut this shorter than normal, just so you know.
No problem. No, that's fine. I mean, it's good stuff. Everything we had to talk about. So. I mean, it's one of those areas that you could do a monster podcast, but I think we touched on a lot of interesting stuff for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, friends. Well, this has been fantastic. As always, it's an honor to be able to hang out and do these live on Sunday morning, my time, Sunday afternoon, Michael's time. And so thanks for hanging out with us. If you're watching this by replay, as we've streamed it into the various groups and pages, feel free to leave questions underneath or comments, or give us a like or love. Let us know where you watched it from. And we'd be happy to answer questions as well about the ROI thinking and ideas. And Michael, you mentioned a couple cool books. I think I mentioned Robert Kiyosaki, which everybody knows, the Rich Dad Poor Dad book. There's no need to get that, but you mentioned a couple unique ones. Do you want to throw them under the show notes and or in the lives wherever we're broadcasting?
Yeah, sure. I can't put them into the live because I don't think I've.
Okay, sure.
In the comments? Oh no, I can see the comments, but I can't put them in. Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes. So one is Greg Crabtree, which is it's Simple Numbers, Straight Talk, Big Profits. I think it is. Was it Straight Talk? Yeah, Simple Numbers, Straight Talk, Big Profits. Kind of entertaining. Yeah, he's really, really good. He's a CPA, American chap, but who has a really great line in simplifying things to the point where they're really useful to small business owners rather than just accountants. So that's really, really good stuff. I think that's the main thing that struck me. The other place that I referenced that I got the annualized return on investment formula from is, I think, called the Corporate Finance Institute, which is really good. They run a lot of really good training programs. It's actually, for corporate finance training, it sounds really corporate and big and unfriendly, but it's actually run by a fairly smallish group of people in Canada, but they've got to hook up with some of the guys in London who train the investment bankers. So they're really good at training people to think about investments. So the Corporate Finance Institute is a really great place. Lots of free, interesting information from there. So that's where I got the formula from.
Okay, man. Awesome. Good times. Well, let's end it here. And thanks again, everybody, for taking the time with us today. And we'll see you next week again for our next episode.